Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and I'm the host of the What is a Good Life podcast. For those of you that followed the newsletter last year, for which I interviewed 120 people around this question, the objective remains very much the same. I'm trying to provide you with tools and content that help you reflect on your own life and that ultimately help you find your own answer to this question. While I'm also trying to share what I perceive to be genuine expressions of the human experience. In episode 4, we're joined by Jindy Mann. Jindy and I are both sharing our journeys of working with therapists. Jindy is a co-founder of Leader Brother Son, an organization that works with both individuals and organizations, with the goal of helping men to be better and happier colleagues, fathers, partners, friends, and leaders, brothers, sons, and so forth. Ultimately, they achieve this through having more vulnerable, open, and honest conversations with men around topics that men don't typically talk about, all of which represents a significant departure from Jindy's past lives in management consultancy and banking. Jindy is also a very good mate of mine, and we thought it would just be good to have a conversation where two men talk openly about their experiences with therapy, not only from the point of view of reducing stigma, but also just giving people more insight into what the experience of therapy is actually like, how it works, what you might expect from it, and also just to show that it's a perfectly normal topic of conversation. In this podcast, we share what was happening in our lives that led us to seek therapy, what moments instigated the process, what we wanted to explore and heal, what surprised us about the process, and what lasting changes and benefits we took from our experiences with therapy. So without further ado, the 4th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. I was just trying to make it awkward, sorry.
Oh, you know how to relax a guest.
Jindy, thank you very much for joining me today. Very grateful to have you here. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Really good. Yeah, refreshed from a long break, and yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And you know the reason why we're here today, Jindy, yes?
I do. I know it well.
And how do you feel about sharing your experiences with therapy?
That's a great question. I think I'm pretty comfortable with it these days. Well, probably since I started having therapy, but then that's part of the process itself. So I feel not just comfortable. I think it's quite helpful and valuable to talk about things like therapy quite openly.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's curious how something so shockingly like such a horrible, shocking notion is actually something that feels relatively comfortable at this stage.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's actually in some ways quite mundane. Yeah, one of those things that there's a taboo around talking around. Yeah.
So if I begin, Jindy, with the question of what is it that was occurring in your life that you felt the need to go see a therapist for the first time?
Hmm. Um, so I think it was what was occurring and had occurred in my life that led me to therapy. And at that point, I started having therapy about, I think it was about 3 years ago, and I had been on a journey of, I guess you'd describe it as deepening my self awareness for about 15 years. I'd started working with a coach about 15 years ago. Um, and that journey had taken me in different directions and deep places, and it had continued to evolve. And I'd also reached a point in my life. At that point, I was 42, and I think the age is quite relevant because I was, had a certain distance from certain parts of my life and accumulated a certain amount of life experience. So I was starting to sort of piece things together, but in quite an unskilled way. And I'd also started my journey of starting my coaching practice and having my coaching training. And in going through that, inevitably, when you go through any training like that, you learn a lot more about yourself, and you go to aspects of yourself that in a deeper way than you have before, even if you know something about them. And so I came out the end of that process of, this long period of these years of self-discovery, um, doing all sorts of different things, and then doing my coach training, and then realizing there were these corners of myself that I hadn't looked in, and that if I was going to be effective in coaching and continuing to do the sort of work that I do, then I needed to look in these corners. So it became just blindingly obvious to me that I needed some support with that. And so therapy was actually quite a simple and easy decision to make at that point. But 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years prior to that, it would have been. I'd thought about it over those years and tried it once. I had one session, maybe 7 years prior to that, and couldn't bring myself to fully commit to it. But at that point, I felt ready, and it felt essential as well.
And can you tell me then, because we talked about this before, and I assumed when you first went to see a therapist who was a similar age that I was, but I realized that was a coaching relationship that you had where you did explore different things around emotions. What kind of distinction were you making where a therapist was required as opposed to other interventions that you had tried before?
Yeah, I think when I started working with my coach, I was about 30, and um, I was basically feeling kind of lost or confused about my direction in life. And so I came up against all this stuff, like my own fears and anxieties, my own sense of identity, um, and and kind of underneath all of that was this real resistance and kind of fear of connecting with my emotions. And so she just started to help me open things up a little bit and help me recognize some of these resistances and fears and anxieties that are around in trying to make this quite practical change about what am I going to do next with my career and other aspects of my life. And that was a long unfolding process. But as good coaching always does, and she's a fantastic coach, it just opened things up that eventually become these big cracks. But what I was looking for at that point was very different to what I was looking for when I started thinking seriously about therapy. And I think what I was looking for at the point I was looking to work with a therapist was a really intentional making sense of my past, particularly my childhood and my family, which
Oh,
are kind
lovely
of,
stuff.
yeah, all the good stuff, right? All the good stuff.
Yeah,
And,
the
and,
light
and,
stuff. Yeah.
and as I said, I've been doing that in quite a sort of unskilled or sort of private way for a few years, and I realized I needed some help with that, some support with that, and that is stuff that, yeah, your reaction is exactly the right one. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, the basement, as I call it. Let's go in the basement and have a look. Um, and so, yeah, that was a difference. It was very intentionally going back to these parts of my life that I hadn't really examined properly. I needed some help in looking at and trying to make sense of them.
Yeah. And was there something happening in your life at that point where I don't know, like was there a friction point or a pain point that was instigating this, or that was heightening the need for it?
Um, Well, there was that general realization that I mentioned that this was a place I needed to go to, but actually, you just triggered a memory.
Oh fuck! Sorry.
It's I was dating a woman, and she had done a lot of work as a counselor, and uh, she had extraordinary levels of intuition, um, and it became apparent to me that we were going to be friends rather than, oh, that was the way I felt. And so we started sort of gravitating towards friendship, and we both sort of realized that's what it was going to be. But through that process of kind of realization, there was a moment where she said to me, she said that you seem to be carrying something, and the word that comes to mind is grief. There's a sense of heaviness about you. And I had told her very little about my childhood, my family history, hardly anything, in fact. And that landed with me like I felt it in my body so heavily. It was like, oof, someone has seen me and seen straight through me. And at that point, I remember that moment vividly. It was like, it is unavoidable to me that it's unavoidable that I don't explore this. And therapy was the obvious answer to that.
I guess then that's a shared experience we have in what triggered the initial requirement.
What was yours?
A couple of things that like it was also related to a relationship, but all through my 20s, I would say I had highly dysfunctional relationships, and a lot of it down to me. Um, probably, yeah, probably most of it we can say. Um, then an ex of mine, we're having a. I don't. I think a lot of like in this circumstance, an ex of mine kind of couldn't reconcile that I seemed like such a nice guy, that I was quite caring most of the time. And then like at times I was just completely irrational, jealous, and then a bit like I could be like mean, like I had a temper. Like it just seemed like not quite Jekyll and Hyde, if you know what I mean. Because you know me, like I'm not afraid of a bit of confrontation. So I'm not saying I like there's a completely mellow side of me and this and there's nothing in between, if you get me. But I remember after trying to make sense of my behavior, instead of simply calling me an asshole, which would have been warranted, and I think that was usually the response that I got. The question came forth: "Do you even know why you're doing this?" And it was kind of funny, man. I would pride myself on winning almost any argument from almost like an unassailable position, and then almost convince the other, like I could be manipulative enough that I'd almost convince the other person that they were wrong. Like that was my mechanism for trying to
Mm.
weasel my way out of things. But when I was just given the question, do you even know why you're doing this? I was completely floored. Like I had uh like, and just like a bit like you in your experience, like it's not that in your experience like a truthful observation was made. In my experience it was a question which didn't allow me, it didn't erect my usual defenses, insofar as if it came in a, if that was leveled at me with like a punch of "you're a dickhead, you're an arse," whatever, then
Mm.
I'd probably have battered it off. But because it wasn't accompanied with one of those things, I kind of had to just bear the brunt of it.
Mm.
And then, like you, in that relationship, the writing was on the wall by the time I went to therapy anyway, and even becoming more friends before the thing ended as well. But then, carrying on the process thereafter.
Yeah. Uh, there's something in that question she asked you. It's like that experience of hearing something that cuts through, that is so carries such weight and truth that you can't avoid it.
Yeah, but as well, I think I was tired of carrying the load. Um, and in a way, the question kind of opened up. The question opened up the possibility to just drop some of this stuff.
Mm.
Um, because for me, I was always projecting huge confidence, like, or arrogance, definitely in my 20s, right? I If I met someone in a bar, I'd be very confident in going up and chatting and talking shit and saying how wonderful I am. But then when I got into a committed relationship, I'm sure we'll touch on this, family stuff again, that was unresolved for me. Um, as soon as I get into a relationship, I became a nervous, jealous wreck.
Mm.
Like constantly thinking that I was going to be betrayed. And then if I ever heard from somebody, um, "Oh, I really find your confidence attractive," or something, then I was just like, "Oh fuck, I have to keep this up now the whole time," you know. So yeah, like for me, it was. I think it was just someone asked me a question as opposed to attacking me. Even justifiably so in a lot of the other situations when someone would have retaliated more so than attacked me.
Mm.
But I knew that my way of approaching relationships was just completely unsustainable if I ever wanted to be in a steady, loving, consistent relationship.
Mm. And how old were you when that happens?
31 or 32. Yeah. So at this point in my life, it was different from yours. I hadn't explored anything with coaching. Like I'd always read some books, maybe the odd book on pop psychology here or there. I'd been intrigued with uh, maybe I'd still say I had some emotional intelligence, if you know what I mean, or I was willing to have some conversations while still very like feeling very uncomfortable about ever admitting a vulnerability or exploring anything like that. So yeah, I was still very much in that phase. Watching sport, hanging out with the lads, boozing away, trying to meet a woman if I was single, or trying to find someone to be in a relationship, gambling, working out. Like that
Mm,
was my world at the time, I'd say.
mm, yeah. And then, what happened next? How did you go about? How did you enter into therapy?
I had a sister, and I still have a sister, who was a clinical psychologist, and I said to her, like, I need help, like, because I still at that time I said the writing was on the wall, but I still, I don't know, maybe I still wanted that relationship to see if there was a chance if I changed my behavior, but more so like it was more like a future thought, like that the realization was just so clear at this point that this relationship, whatever happens happens, but if I stay the way I am, this is just going to constantly repeat.
Mm, mm, yeah.
When this lady stuck her thrusted her fist into your solar plexus.
I ripped my stomach and my heart out.
Yeah. What was your feeling at that point?
um,
Or sorry, what were even your next steps from that point? I think would be a better question.
yeah. I think I can't remember my exact next steps, but I think it kind of, as the truth often does, it kind of confirmed something I already felt I knew. But it was like the final, if there's such a thing as a messenger from the universe, it was like it required someone actually said it to me, out loud to my face. It was like, okay, right. What more? How many more signs do I need? So I think after that, I started looking for a therapist and just started the process of finding one and having a few conversations with different therapists. Actually, I actually asked her advice because of her background in counselling, what sort of therapy might be useful for me, knowing that there were some different types, and she gave me some really useful guidance, which actually helped me find one. Um, and then it kind of, and then it went from there. It took on an energy of its own, a life of its own, really. But it had become, I think, for me, once things become that evident, uh, they do take on a life of their own. There's no effort required anymore. It's just some unavoidable thing has been surfaced, and it actually takes more energy to ignore it than to do something about it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. Like
so that was the way
the
it felt.
pain of maintaining is now greater than the pain of
Yeah,
seeking help or
exactly.
speaking up. Yeah, yeah. In terms, man, then of just how you like at this point, like in terms of your experience growing up and things like that, do you think that it was a case of like you couldn't speak to people about this, or that it was just too messy or too painful, or what was the need for a therapist beyond even, I don't know, like having a heart to heart with this lady, or whoever else may have been in your group at that point?
Yeah, I think there was this realization by that point that the stuff I felt I needed to or wanted to deal with, um, there probably wasn't anyone else in my life who could hold that for me or hold it with any skill. So My brother was one person I'd have conversations with this about, and kind of some of the things I wanted to explore around childhood and family. But we were both just sort of, fumbling around in the dark a little bit and making sense of it. And it did actually. I'm being perhaps a little bit unkind. I think that actually took me a long way in talking about this with someone who understood it instinctively. But what I needed was someone completely independent and skilled, who I could just really unleash, the most difficult stuff to, and they would hold it and help me make sense of it. And that's for me anyway. I don't have any friends or other people in my life who could do that. I've got plenty of great friends, great listeners. We're very open about things, but this was really going into the corners of the most difficult things, most challenging, and most complicated things that have happened to me in my life. And and that for me felt like I needed someone with a bit of skill and a bit of experience in making sense of that.
How did you manage to keep it between the ditches, so we shall we say, up until this point?
Keep it between the ditches.
Like in terms of, like, you have this stuff that you're saying is almost like it was heavy, it was messy, but you still managed to get to the age of 42 where you still kind of, you had a good job, you had some friends in your life. Sorry, double scratch there. You had some friends in your life. Like, life on the outside wasn't falling apart. I'm assuming you were even with this lady who you said was quite a compassionate soul.
Hmm.
So it's not like everything on the outside was a mess or something like that, right?
Yeah, completely. Completely opposite, actually. I'd say my life at that point was in a very, very good place, and that perhaps that's part of the reason I felt ready. I felt like I was coming from a platform of feeling quite secure, quite solid. I had a much better sense of who I was versus when I was 30 or 25, uh, and much more ready to kind of open up about those things. My 20s were a lot of fun for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned, like booze and partying and all those things. But actually, if when I'm looking back now from this perspective, from this place, also riddled with anxiety and confidence that I was masking with a lack of confidence I was masking with arrogance. And I built this kind of edifice of stuff that made me look and feel good. And some of it was useful and real, and some of it was just a facade. It was just a variety of masks, and that included, to some extent, my career. And so I'd kind of gone from that place to a place of feeling quite good about myself, but realizing there was work to be done. And so I think the stuff I needed to work on was now what was left. Um, I could have avoided it. I could have carried on going, and I think many people do just carry on. So there's no need to sort of open those doors. Um, but for me, I'd been on a journey and I'm still on a journey that it's never ending. So there's always something to find out. And there is a danger there. I was having a conversation with someone who's a mentor and a supervisor to me recently, and he didn't use these words, but there is a danger for me, I think, or a risk that I sometimes enjoy doing this work a bit too much. And we've talked about this, our proclivity for suffering and digging into the really dark and difficult stuff. But there is also something really valuable about it and important about it. And it's taken on added resonance now because I'm going to be a father in 4 months. And that for me is even more reason to understand myself and what I might pass on
Yeah, yeah.
unwittingly, and how I might be a father in ways that I don't want to be necessarily, or patterns that I might continue, and all of those things. So, as well as my work, there's a very personal reason for making sense of myself.
And so, how did your therapy journey begin?
Yeah, I'm laughing because you know that. Yeah, you know, you know how this story starts. So
One spring sunny day.
one spring sunny day. It was a spring sunny day, as all good stories begin. I had found a few therapists, and this was the first one I was going to speak to, have a conversation with. So it was meant to be like a 20-minute sort of chemistry, let's see how we get on situation. And for some reason, I thought I'd do this call while I was walking through my local park on this lovely hot spring day. And I was also at that time recently started microdosing with psilocybin, which, as you know, kind of one of the effects of psilocybin is it opens you up. It kind of just releases some of the ego barriers. So I was in quite a sort of open space, which was probably actually helpful. And so we started this call as I was walking through the park, and this 20-minute call became a 1 hour, over 1 hour call, because she simply asked me, like the question she asked was something like, "So why are we talking?" or
Right.
what brought you to this conversation? And
Oh man,
I
it's
then just
amazing how something so simple
it
can
it's
open the floodgates.
yeah, completely. It's so cliched, but also true that I've I just started to speak and I spoke non-stop for about 15 minutes. And in that process, realized there was stuff I'd wanted to say for years and just hadn't, and I was carrying it like this weight. And in this process of just like blurting this out and her listening, I just broke down in tears, and I was leaning against a tree in my local park, and just tears just pouring off my face. And it was such a wild mixture of emotions. It was um, mostly relief, I'd say, just this sense of like a deep breath out. It's like, I'm burdening myself with some of this,
Yeah,
and
it's it's amazing it's amazing the baggage we're holding on to as we go through life if some of this stuff remains unexpressed.
yeah, yeah,
I think
completely,
I forget which book it was of Carl Jung's, but he was almost describing a secret as a psychic poison.
yeah,
And the deeper this stuff is, and especially if you're talking about stuff from childhood, the more or the deeper it is, and the more it's kind of, I don't know, it just contaminates like so many things that are built upon this, this one
mm,
point of pain.
yeah, yeah, and the more it's repressed, the more it gathers energy, sitting there in your unconscious, um, and fucks around with your life, relationships, friendships, work, everything you do will be contaminated by that poison.
So you're in the park. She simply asks you, "Why are we here?" Cue an hour-long conversation, many, many tears. And where did you go from there?
Um, so after that conversation, I had one session with her in person. But in that period, in that intervening period, I found
You
someone.
had to at that stage after making an hour out of a free 20-minute call.
well,
The guilt.
well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, maybe I felt some obligation, but she also probably knew more about my life at that point than most of my friends.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I had one session with her, but uh, in the period between those two conversations, I had one of these other sort of first conversations with someone who I instinctively felt had um, I had much better chemistry with, and she had uh, an instinctive understanding of my background as well, because she's from an Asian background, she's British Asian, so as soon as we started talking, there was a sense of she gets some of what I'm saying without even saying it. So I ended up working with her, and we worked together for about a year, I'd say, and then I've recently started working with her on a more regular basis. And in between, we had check-in sessions. We had conversations where I'd go back to her. So every now and again, I kind of reach out to her and say, yeah, hey, I'd like to have a conversation to work through some things, to make some sense of things, and that's something we've done recently.
And without going into the very depths of it and implicating other people and everything else, but could you kind of give a sense of what you were looking to explore?
Yeah. So I guess the short version is there was things in my early life, childhood, and early family life that I hadn't realised the impact they'd had on me and how traumatic they'd been. Um, and some of them I'd buried. And again, such a cliche, but it was in the process of working with a therapist that I remembered things that were memories that I had effectively repressed about my childhood, and other memories and other aspects of my childhood and family life that I just labelled. I'd conveniently labelled and gone, well, that's that, and or that happens to everyone, or that's what that thing was, without having made sense of that, having really tested that. And it was through working with her I realised, yeah, actually that's not true, and this has had an impact that's still um, lasting, is still present now, and it's showing up in different ways now. Um, so there was lots there. I mean, I grew up poor. I grew up in an immigrant family. I grew up in a family that was carrying a lot of intergenerational trauma, and then a family that created its own trauma in a variety of different ways. So there's all sorts of difficult experiences in my childhood that I had found a way to normalize, which I think is a typical coping mechanism. That this sort of stuff happens to everyone, or I've left it behind now. I've moved on. I did that classic thing of thinking, oh, I've escaped my childhood because I've left home now and I'm now an adult. But actually, some of those experiences stay with you, and
Yeah, yeah, for
until
sure,
you
man.
sort of bring them to light and make sense of them. So there's kind of all of that really, and yeah, I kind of, I guess, yeah, as you alluded to, out of respect for the other people involved, that's probably as much as I should say. But
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. What did you find yourself uncovering and working on?
Very simply, it was I came up with an unbelievably compelling narrative that my father leaving the family home at a young age had absolutely zero effect on me, um, which is pretty impressive. Like if somebody had asked me, me and my father are in a good place at this point. But really, I think it was I came up with coping mechanisms for him not being around, um, and then anger was definitely a coping mechanism for me growing up. I think like my father would kind of visit us on holidays for a short period each year, and then you'd say goodbye again. And I was always, I always can remember it now being very upset at the time. And I think at some point I turned a switch or something, and I decided this wasn't going to bother me anymore. Um, and then the crazy thing is, like, even through my 20s, I was coming up with like stories, like if somebody even said anything about if I lived in different countries from the age of 26. So if I was out on a date and somebody said, "Oh, are your parents still back in Ireland?" and I just say, "Oh, my father's in the UK and my mum's in Ireland." And then they go, "Oh, really? When did they split up?" And then I'd say, "Oh, when I was 1 years of age, he had left the house or whatever." And then at that point, I'd swoop in with, "But my mum's an absolute Trojan. I really love my brother and sister. I know some families that aren't as comfortable with their siblings as I am. I have three aunties that were single that helped us out a lot. Like I'd never needed for love from them, or I never needed for things." Um, and so there was always this compelling kind of cover up.
Mm,
And then, as I said, like then instead of ever leaning into that, I think I was always a bit of a powder keg ready to go off, like anger came very, very easily to me growing up, even playing sports, or I don't know. Then, like in relationships, as I said, leaning into arrogance as opposed to being myself or showing any kind of vulnerability. And yeah, just like I don't know, just like almost creating a character or something to not have to feel what I felt, I think. And yeah, so in my case, then when I went to a therapist, it was she she had her work cut out for her in the first session. I wasn't, you referenced having already seen a coach, having kind of some like emotional vocabulary or experience of trying to unpack some of this stuff. But for me, uh, I think I'd read a few books on psychology before I went in there. So anytime she'd ask me how I was feeling, I pathologically analyzed myself or gave like elaborate theories as to why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Um, and then I remember at one point, no, she's like, no, I said, how are you feeling?
Mm.
And I'd shoot off again. Like I think she gave me around 3 or 4 attempts to answer the question, "How are you feeling?" And I couldn't. And so going back to it, I think at some point I'd cut myself off completely from my like a feeling of pain or something. Like I think I knew anger, and of course, like anger sits on top of pain or some sort of
Mm.
feeling of vulnerability. Anger obviously can be useful in of itself, but I mean not in the way that anger was a masking kind of agent or experience for me.
Mm.
um so eventually, yeah, this woman was a really good therapist too. She began to teach me certain things, like even being able to say I instead of you. Like, you know, when you think about how like it's amazing until you start paying attention to this. It's amazing how much we speak in the you form than the
Mm.
I form.
Yeah.
Like, so an example would be like, how you doing today, Mark? Ah, yeah, good. When you have those kind of days, or you just say
Mm.
you all the time, and
Mm.
when you actually notice it, it's actually quite a it's not even all that subtle. Like
Yeah.
when you've been made aware to speak from the I perspective as opposed to the you perspective when you're talking about your feelings, um, it's really kind of, I don't know, it's a really enlightening moment where you're like,
Mm.
holy fuck, like I've
Yeah.
almost been creating this external entity where you don't even have to express your emotions
Mm.
just like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's kind of when you this. I mean, I'm sure you see this in your coaching all the time. I see it in coaching all the time, and in the men's groups. It's this kind of distancing the feelings that we're experiencing by saying you. It's like this person over here. The moment you
Yeah,
switch to I, the energy changes, um, and when I realised I needed to get better at doing that, the first thing I noticed was the discomfort of really owning these emotions. I feel angry. I feel upset. I feel abandoned. I feel whatever it might be. It just there's a complete shift when you really start to own it.
yeah. When you now, once again, we obviously went at different stages in life. But for me, I probably viewed myself as a car that was going into a garage. That'd be a very clear and concise path to it being fixed. Um, I remember continuously kind of asking, almost like asking a coach, like in a sports sense of like, will I be starting next week? Yeah, what have I got to do, coach? Do I have to do more reps? Do I have to do more sprints? I like continuously kind of checking in, saying, so when do you think we're going to be done here? Not kind of realizing the entangled quagmire you're kind of engaging in when you go
Mm.
beneath the surface and you start to explore and unpack your emotions. Did you have a kind of a more educated perspective on that, or was there an impatience for you as well?
Uh, Not when I went to therapy, but yes, when I went to coaching, when I started coaching, I had the similar sort of, okay, so when are we going to figure this out? What's the roadmap? Show me the roadmap. Which I think
Yeah.
is also probably, I haven't seen any data on this, but I suspect that's more common in men than it is in women. This kind of, yeah, I need to see this clear deadline, this target, this goal. I need to see progress. So no, by the time I came to therapy, I was a bit more kind of, let's see where this goes. It will take as long as it needs to, and it will probably go in directions that I can't predict. And both of those things were true. Um, so I think that was, I think, the virtue of coming to it later and having done some of that other work. But I think if I'd come to it when I was in my 20s or early 30s, I think I would have had, yeah, I would have gone in with that, when we're going to be done, show me the roadmap. And also, in a similar way to you, I would have had an elaborate set of defenses, or perhaps not so elaborate, but I would have had a set of defenses against the work I really needed to do. Um,
Yeah, less sophisticated defenses, I'm sure.
Nowhere near as sophisticated as yours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're very, very complex. How are you? How are you feeling? Is there is there anything that kind of what surprised you about the process most?
Mm, that's a good question. I think one thing is how good it felt. Um, I was curious about whether I might feel at some point resistant or bored or that it's difficult. But it felt really good. It felt really, and I think again, I think that's a reflection of when I came to it and how ready I was for it. But it felt even when it was hard and difficult and brought up difficult memories and emotions, it kind of felt good, if that makes sense. It felt like that was right, that needed to be surfaced, and that was a little bit of a surprise. I think the other thing is how much I remembered that I'd forgotten, parts of my story, parts of my life that I'd completely forgotten about or buried or repressed, as I said, came back to me, just came flooding back. Um, so that was quite a surprise as well.
Yeah, it's that's a bit of a trippy experience, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
something has literally been covered over, and and of course, memories can be they're not such an exact experience or a reflection of what the experience was, but
Mm,
yeah, stuff that you experienced. Like you're left in no doubt that this wasn't some figment of your imagination. Like even if
mm.
all the details aren't perfect, like holy shit, how did I actually forget that incident happening?
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, yeah. Completely, completely. It's yeah. Memory's a funny thing, as you said. It's unreliable, um, uh, and yet at the same time, you can forget these fundamental parts of your life, or perhaps things that for me didn't feel significant at the time, and now there's this realization that actually that was significant, and maybe that's why I'm remembering it now. Um, there's always that curiosity of why am I remembering this now, and I think that's what for me that was what happened in the process and can happen in therapy or coaching or any good conversation where you're exploring yourself. Yeah, stuff comes back to you. It's this kind of like you said, it feels almost magical. It feels almost yeah, like there's something mysterious going on.
I think the big difference then between your experience and my experience is mine was opening kind of Pandora's box, having no clue what was in there. And yours then was okay. I've done a certain amount of digging around this. If I don't explore this, I'm probably always going to hold myself back because this thing is remained untouched or unspoken or unseen. But you had a good idea what was there. And then for me, it was quite a different experience because I had really I'd really no idea what I was kind of getting into. I think the thing that surprised me was more so the more so the fact that it felt good to cry.
Mm.
Like thinking about it, like that was probably oh shit. Like I know it's obvious now to say there's healing in tears, um, but yeah, I was really surprised at just how nice it felt to have an outlet to just cry.
Mm.
You
Mm.
know what other thing really surprised me though was so I was quite open with my friends that I was seeing a therapist, and now granted this is maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I was living in London at the time, and as I said, living a very kind of typical existence at the time for boozing, watching sports. So if I was around with the lads watching some sport at the weekend, they might say, "Oh, well, we do this on Wednesday," and I'd just dropped in. "Oh no, I'm seeing a therapist. I see my therapist on a Wednesday or something like that." And they're like, "What? You see a therapist?" And it opened up all these conversations, and just the amount of my mates that had said or that just had curiosity around what the hell's that like, what are you experiencing, why does that, like, why did you feel like you needed to do this, and then even other friends, a handful of other friends that had seen therapists like a number of years or even a couple of years back for periods of time, and they were opening up to me with it.
Mm.
And that was, I don't know, that was really surprising to me.
Mm. And they'd never told you before.
Never told me at all.
Mm.
No.
I had a
Like they
really,
needed, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I had a very similar experience. Um, all of my friends were really supportive, interested, curious, and it enabled these conversations where I was telling them why and the stuff I was working on. And there was one friend, one of my closest friends, who, when I told him, he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, I had a therapist 12 years ago," and I was like, "What the fuck?" We've literally seen each other like twice a week for the last decade, or longer than that, and you've never told me this before. Um, yeah, which was interesting to me. So, I mean, if you were to speculate, what's going on there?
Stigma, 100%, I'd say.
Hmm.
Um, Fucking Irish males in their early 30s living in London.
Yeah.
Like, there's probably, there'd be few kind of demographics in the world that would be less likely to speak, I'd say, about therapy. And like I know I
I'd
mentioned this
add
in the
Asian
pre.
men to that as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. I'm sure there's like a lot of demographics that are saying no. My demographic amongst males is the worst for this. Like maybe we can have some sort of competition. I don't know how that would go, but we can figure it out sometime. No, but the idea definitely would have been stigma, and I think this is the most unfortunate part is that everyone who I told, and I mean this for any secret that I've held, because there's stuff that I've even realized after therapy that I started just talking about more freely, that would have been things that I would have thought I'd never tell anyone, or I'll keep this with me to the grave. And I've never had an experience with another man when I've just said it and owned it, like I've only got respect back, you
Hmm.
know? Like and usually then they share something with me as well. Um but I've said some stuff where lads have just gone, oh, I think you're much more of a man for saying that. Because the weird thing is, right, like we're like we're to do something courageous is to do something that you have fear for. If you're not afraid of it, it doesn't matter how kind of manly or masculine it feels or looks like, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
How can the brave thing or how can the courageous thing be to pretend that your life is something other than it is? Do you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
how can that be seen as strength?
Hmm.
Like I'm literally going to act, but and then I'm not going to tell anyone about it because I'm afraid to tell somebody about it.
Hmm.
And like trust me, I get why people feel like that or view things that way. You know, it's I didn't feel like it was an option for me all through my 20s to even say something like I feel insecure and jealous in relationships.
Hmm.
That would have been to me, that would have been almost like I couldn't think of like more difficult punishments.
Hmm.
And now it would seem so bloody innocuous to me. Like, and I think that's the other thing too. it's almost like a, I don't know, once you break the cycle of not telling things, and I don't mean this in this like overly exhibition style of vulnerability. I know you've kind of coined it vulnerability porn before. I just mean like simple simple insights into your life, like the
Mm,
stuff that I just share quite freely on a regular basis now, in a respectful way, like stuff that I've kind of looked at myself or processed, and I'm not just dumping on people.
mm,
Like once you start you kind of look back on, oh my god, I was afraid to say that. Isn't that
mm,
fucking fascinating?
yeah,
Like, because right now it wouldn't seem like a big deal at all to say that.
yeah. And how? What did you notice about the impact that had on your relationships?
Oh, dude, like that's. So I'm just gonna pour some water here. You put me on the spot now, Jindy. I need to, I need to wet my beak. Um, Tremendously, man. Like, look, the main focus, as I say, was romantic relationships, right? Like that was going to be kind of the acid test for this, whether the therapy had worked or not, Um, and you know, I think within a year of starting therapy, I had met my wife, and we started off in a completely bullshit free zone. And we've maintained that, like, you have fights with your partner and you have ups and downs and whatever else, but like our communication has always been very, very clean.
Mm,
So we started off with, when we met, just we both met in India. Like, so she's from Germany, I'm from Ireland. We're both out of our environment. We're both going through experiences. We're there to, once again, I wasn't trying to learn meditation to be more enlightened or something. I was trying to figure out tools and methods to regulate my own emotions better, my own reactions better. So instead of, when she asked me, "What are you doing here?" I could have gone, "Oh, well, I'm doing these vipassanas and I'm doing this, staying in this ashram, and I'm just very spiritual like that or something." And I was just like, "Oh no, like I've been a lunatic for most of my 20s. Like I've been in unhealthy relationships, a lot of it down to me." And it was just a pretty frank conversation.
mm,
And she told me stuff about her experiences in life, and I think we removed 6 months of the bullshitty interlude of like, I'm wonderful. Oh no,
mm,
no. Oh, you really are wonderful. Oh, so am I wonderful. God, we're so wonderful.
yeah,
And then the defenses eventually drop, or
mm,
the cracks appear, and you finally get to meet each other. Like, had
yeah,
we met in, maybe it was because we were there, but also because of maybe this experience with therapy. But had we met a year before in a bar, my missus always says to me, I don't think I probably would have like, maybe I would have been attracted to or something, but we probably wouldn't have gone out.
mm,
And in
yeah,
this circumstance, we were married pretty early on into our relationship.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, we often joke about that, me and my wife, that how would we have been if we'd met when we were like 30? And I think very similar. Probably would have fancied each other, but there's no way we could have had a lasting relationship. And most of that would have been down to me, I think.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also all relationships then too, right? And like, look, a lot of this gets a bit messy too, because you start establishing new boundaries, you start showing up in a different way. Um, for me personally, I start showing up, and maybe, as I said, wearing vulnerability on my sleeve, throwing it around a little bit, messily, I think. Also telling people in my circle to meditate. Like I did a few things that were probably pretty insufferable. It's probably testament, or to the relationships I have, that some people hung in there for and maybe a 12 to 18 month period.
Mm,
But now, like, but now relationships, now where I'm kind of in a more stable place with even expressing that stuff over the last number of years. Like, even if you use the example of our relationship, like our friendship, like, man, we we hardly wasted any time with bullshit, in
mm,
terms of, like, I got to meet you the first time we went for a coffee. And for context, for people listening, I've known Jindy for around 11 months now at this stage. But there was just, how are you doing? What stage are you at in life? Where are you at with your career? Just just shooting from the hip.
mm,
Like, and just the amount of trust you can build with people when you
yeah,
do that. Like, you could know someone for 10 years, and you could have one of these relationships where sometimes when people are shocked that their friend has been depressed or is about to have burnout. And
Mm.
look, I know some people can be very secretive, but I do kind of wonder, like, what conversations are you having
Mm.
that you can be truly shocked that a friend, and now, once again, some people can be amazing actors, but I still think if you're probing a little bit, there would have to be clues, like even
Mm.
just when you're paying attention, when you're around them and this kind of thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, paying attention is I mean that term itself, excuse me, speaks volumes. There's a lot behind that, I think, and there's a lot around vulnerability, I think, in what you said. That I think there is something what it's very common, I think, when you've had therapy. Certainly, when I had therapy, and what you're describing is you become slightly insufferable for a while because
Yeah,
you
yeah.
start sort of opening up and telling people. But there is something about that. For me, it was about I want people to know. I now want people to know the real me or more of the real me because I'm comfortable sharing it. And as you said, there is this vulnerability porn thing. It feels there's a bit of a fad at the moment towards pushing people towards vulnerability, and that I think is a little bit dangerous. I think for me, it, being vulnerable depends on whether the person being vulnerable has adequately processed what they're being vulnerable about and whether they're sharing it in a place or with people that is adequately safe to hold it and contain it as well. So vulnerability for its own sake is actually, I think, potentially dangerous and counterproductive. But there is, in the right use, like embraced in the right way, it does create much stronger relationships on the off, like our friendship, like you described, because there was very little guardedness, and we were being very open about ourselves in a quite processed way. I could tell, this is a guy I can be quite open with and tell him, tell him all these aspects of myself about, and vice versa, and that creates this really strong trust from the off. But there is a level of judgment required in, am I ready to share this, and is this person ready to hear it?
Yeah, and I think for periods of time, particularly when traveling around the world, when you're not in your home town or something like that, or even just living in different cities when people haven't known you all your life, um, I was like at times like a little bit of a spray gun when I was kind of getting used to this, and as well, like in India when I took that first sabbatical after I'd seen a therapist for around 9 months or a year, there was lots of people that were just traveling at that point where like there's almost a fakeness to it too. Like if all these people that I've only known even over a cup of coffee, and it was different in my conversation with my missus. It wasn't this wild spraying of things. It was just a few top level laying out of the facts of why I was there, really. But in other circumstances, if a whole bunch of new people know you better or know more intimate things about you than your brothers, your sisters, your long term friends, there's something really kind of top heavy about that, or it doesn't feel so genuine.
Mm,
And I think that's probably a good acid test as well of like how comfortable you are with this. Like, would you tell a friend that maybe isn't of this, kind of very open, certain perspective or certain view on life? Like, would you be willing to share there? Like,
mm,
does it feel safe to share?
mm.
I kind of agree with what you're referring to there.
Yeah, and I think there's something really important in that. And to come back to your question earlier about what was hardest about therapy, it was perhaps what happened afterwards, and what is kind of still happening as I kind of work through things and delve into things. It's it's kind of going back to some old friendships, old relationships, my oldest friends, and needing to almost get them to reappraise me and aspects of my life that hadn't been, I wouldn't say untruthful about, but I created a story around that I now need to sort of say, actually, this is the real story as I understand it now from this more aware place, and that is probably more uncomfortable than therapy itself for some reason, because I think it's kind of going back to these really old friendships and going, yeah, actually, there's all this stuff I haven't told you, or actually the way I've been describing this part of my life and these people in my life isn't actually the case. There's now this more truthful story.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, like, it's, some of the reasons why we wear various masks, maybe as a protective mechanism. It's always a deeply vulnerable process to bare your soul or yourself, even with someone you've known a long time. Like, I think there's a few things in life where we over index or overweight the importance of time. Like, and we kind of view the quality of relationship. Oh, how long are you guys friends? Oh, 20 years. Oh, wow. So you just assume that means you guys are the best of friends.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they're the person that knows you the most,
Mm.
or that knows the most about you or understands you the most. So I do think that we should probably have a lot more of a focus on what's the quality of the information that we're exchanging, what's the depth of the information that we're exchanging. Like,
Mm.
those would be, as well as time, because of course time is still a key part of a lot of these relationships.
Mm.
But just looking at our relationships more that way, like,
Mm.
how what can I say I understand about someone other than the surface level stuff that most people know about them? I
Mm.
think that would be a pretty good indicator. And of course, look, everyone has their own preference for relationships. The amount they're willing to share. There's no kind of set metrics for this, but I don't know. Those are other elements that I think that we don't pay as much attention to when
Mm.
kind of judging a friendship.
Yeah, I think there's something about are my relationships growing with me, or are they stuck in some kind of charade almost, or are they even holding me back? And something I was talking about recently in some training was, also this thing that kind of emerged for me was this resistance I have to. I have a difficult relationship with groups because groups are kind of essential. We need groups to feel connected, and we need to be part of some groups. But I also don't like being too much in a group because groups require consensus. They require you to kind of fit in and let go of your own ideas. And I what I've noticed in some groups of friends is the safety of staying in them means that individuals don't grow. And so, through partly through fluke, my friendships, there are groups, but they're kind of disparate and spread, and we're all in different countries, and so we don't have this tight group that are all doing the same things and keeping each other in some sort of consensus. And that, I think, is really important for me. I think I now have a real cautiousness about kind of succumbing to a group, unless I feel it's kind of flexible and dynamic enough to allow me to keep growing and being the person that I'm becoming.
Yeah.
So there is something in that as well.
What would you say is and just this will be maybe the second last question I might ask you, but what would you say is the best thing that, or the most influential thing that therapy, how it affected your life thereafter?
Um, well, I don't think I'd be with my wife if I hadn't been in therapy. I feel I could say with some certainty. Actually, I don't think we'd. So we met just over 18 months ago, um, and we knew straight away that this was something special. But I don't think I could have shown up in this relationship if I hadn't had therapy, um, because I was able to start in that way that you described of uh, knowing some of my shit and some of my darkness and being able to share it without fear. And she's the same, fortunately, and that was the foundation of our relationship. People who were willing to be open about, okay, this is not just the nice, shiny part of me. This is also the other part of me, and this is the stuff that I'm working on. This is the stuff that I know about. So yeah, that without question has been the biggest benefit of therapy for me.
I'd probably say something similar myself, like, in that it's I'd say the part that I found most helpful is almost seeing how I'm simultaneously flawed and wonderful, and then being more accepting of other people's flaws and understanding of it. Um, And I just think that really helps. And if you know your shit and you see how complicated a creature I am, like if I see how I have still a proclivity to do X, Y, or Z, even though I'm aware of all these processes, how can I judge someone else to this almost standard of perfection or this standard of logic, which we kind of like to hold other people to? Um,
Which is
I
fucking
definitely think
inconvenient
that.
as well.
Oh yeah, it's terrible, man. It's awful. So much more satisfying when you can just point your finger at everyone and say that
Exactly.
they're horrible and that I'm wonderful. Like, yeah,
That's the evil. That's the bad people over there. Yeah.
yeah, there it is. Jindy, just because we're coming up to the end of time here, because the podcast is called "What Is a Good Life," and although this episode was different in that I just thought it would be interesting for two men to talk about their experiences with therapy, because I think that's helpful for anyone to hear if they're contemplating therapy or if they, I don't know, if they just needed to, I don't know, even the idea of making this less of a stigma or something, that contributes to a good life. But to ask you, what is a good life for you, Jindy?
Hmm. I feel like my answer on this could change every time you ask me, but I think given the conversation we've just had, the answer that really comes to mind is, um, I think, making sense of myself and coming to some peace with that. That, for me, it marks a good life.
Yeah, I think it's peace in the internal world that generally shows up in our external experience of life as well.
Hmm.
Jindy, as ever, an absolute joy to speak to you, sir. Very, very much appreciate you joining me here on What is a Good Life today. And yeah, look forward to speaking again soon.
Mark, thanks. Really appreciate it. Really had a great time. A privilege to be on here amongst all your other prestigious guests. So thank you for asking me.